One common use of the for loop is to average numbers. This is a pretty stereotypical example for early CS education. So let's try that out. Let's write some code that will have the user enter 10 numbers and then print out the average of those 10 numbers. For now, we'll start off with a known range of numbers, and then we'll add some additional complexity by letting the user decide how many numbers to add. So how do we do this? Well, first, we're going to need to create the sum outside of the loop. That's because we want the sum to be continually updated with every time the loop runs. If we created the sum inside the loop, then it would never actually persist any of our information across the entire list of numbers. If we skipped line 2 and just put it inside, one of two things would happen. Either we would end up just resetting the sum equal to the latest number each time the loop runs, or our code would crash because we're trying to add something to it before we actually create some. You can't add to a variable that you haven't yet created. Then on line 4, we have our loop. The loop is actually exactly the same as our previous example. It runs for the numbers 1 to 10, and each time it runs for the numbers 1 to 10, and each time it runs, the variable I takes on the value of the next number. So the first time it runs, I is 1. The second time it runs, I is 2, and so on. The difference here is the body of the loop. Instead of just printing the current value of I, or the current number for the loop, it instead gets some input from the user. That's what that input function does right there. The text inside the input function just gives the user a prompt. So the first time the loop runs, I is 1, and so this says, enter number 1. The user then enters the number, and that number is converted to an integer. Effectively, what this means is that after the user enters a number, the entire input function is replaced with a string of whatever number they entered. Then that string is converted to an integer, which gives us the integer number. So here, on the first run, next number is going to receive the value 91. Line 8 then adds next number to the sum. So every time this loop runs, it gets another number from the user and adds it to the sum. And then at the end, it prints the sum divided by 10, where 10 was the number of numbers we know we added. Here, the user entered the numbers 91 through 100, and so the average was 955 divided by 10, which equals 95.5. Notice again that sum was an integer, but Python knew, because we're dividing, to convert it to a decimal number. Notice a few different things about this example. One, notice that we used the variable I to tell the user each time how many numbers have been entered so far. That was really the only reason we ever used the variable name inside the loop body. Two, notice that in this input function, we used a plus sign, the string conversion, and then the variable, and then another plus sign. When we're just printing, we'll sometimes just use commas instead, and then we don't have to worry about actually converting an integer into a string. But input is a different function. It's not the print function. And it doesn't know how to put together variables the same way as our print function does. So here, if we want to use a variable that holds an integer in the prompt that we give to our user, we have to explicitly convert it to a string. Third, notice that we created sum outside the loop body because we were using sum outside the loop body. We never try to use next number outside the loop, so we don't bother creating it outside the loop. It's only ever used inside that indented code. But what if we didn't want to dictate that the user has to enter 10 numbers? What if we wanted them to be able to enter as many numbers as they wanted? Could we instead let them input what the range would be? Absolutely. Here's how we do it. When this code runs, again, it creates the variable sum on line 2 with the value 0. And then on line 4, it prompts the user to enter how many numbers you want to average. They enter it, it's converted to an integer, and that value is saved in num count. On line 6, we create our for loop the same way we did before, except instead of dictating that it runs from 1 to 11, we instead say that it runs from 1 to num count plus 1. Num count is the number that the user entered, and the plus 1 is because the range function excludes the last number from the range it creates. So if the user wants to input 5 numbers, we want to create a range from 1 to 6, because we know range will exclude that last number. From there though, this code is exactly the same. Inside the body of our loop, we don't really care how many times it's going to run. We still want to print how many times it's run so far, but it doesn't matter how many times it's going to run. So as before, that range function creates a list of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then the body runs for I is 1, and we get number 1, which is 91. Then it runs for I equals 2, we get number 2, which is 92, and so on for 3, 4, and 5. That's why we see 3, 4, and 5 over here. What that means is that each line inside this loop runs multiple times. After it's run for all those numbers, it then continues with the code as normal. And on line 12, we see our only other difference. Instead of dividing by 10, we divide by num count. In other words, instead of dividing by 10 because we knew they were going to enter 10 numbers, we instead divide by num count because we let them input how many numbers they wanted to enter. The user entered 5, And so it ran 5 times, letting them put in 5 numbers. If the user had entered 100, it would have run 100 times for them to enter 100 numbers. If the user had entered 0, it would have never run at all, and then we would have had an error because we can't divide by 0. And if the user had entered Bob, then we would have had an error because we can't convert Bob to an integer. Sorry, Bob.